So there I am, I'm Anthony Oloyede, Building Control Manager. I'm also the President of the London District Surveyors Association. Very briefly what we are, that's the London District Surveyors Association. If you don't know, is all the building control heads sitting around on a monthly basis to discuss building control issues. So I'm the President of that association for this year. We've got my colleague Peter Hackley, who's our Senior Structural Engineer from Hillingdon Council. So the presentation is going to be split into two parts. I'm going to start the first bit, and then Peter takes the second half of it. So the first section I'm going to talk about is the actual Building Act itself. Then I'm going to go on to the Building Regulations 2010, talk a bit about that. I'll then move into the talking a bit about the building control process. Apologies if some of you already know this information about the building control process, but I'll still just briefly take you through that. Peter will then be going on to requirements A1, A2 and A3, speaking about approved document A, giving us some guidance on Part A submissions, discussing about the continued use of withdrawn British standards, identifying some common problems that identify with submissions to building control, which will be quite an interesting one to hear about. And then we'll finish off with some problems that we've noted on site. So, Building Acts is basically, that's the underpinning Bible, that's the power for us to make regulations. Yesterday, while me and Peter were preparing this presentation, I came across a small little article which I'd like to read to you, which basically underpins everything. So I just want to read to you very quickly. Following the Great Fire of London in 1666, King Charles passed the London Rebuilding Act of 1667. Back then, all houses had to be built of brick or stone, and the rudimental rules for space separation was put in place. There was a start of piecemeal building standards in modern Britain. This was the start of piecemeal building standards in modern Britain, which were consolidated in the 1984 Building Act. Now, 350 years later, the huge variety in materials, innovations in design, and the scale of buildings means that building regulations has become an even more important set of principles for the professional team, like yourselves, which includes the local authority building control to help them comparatively achieve the right outcome. So that's our underpinning Bible. That sets out the Act of Parliament. That sets out where we can make that gives us the power to make the regulations, the Building Act. So that was a snippet there from the Building Act, which is the statutory instrument, which is important that before we get into the depth of it, that this is discussed or is brought to your attention. Out of the Building Act, we have the Building Regulations themselves 2010, okay? And that's an extract from the Building Regulations themselves. So it defines, the section that we've taken there is Regulation 3, the meaning of building work. Erection of a building or erection or extension of a building, provision or extension of a control service fitting, material alterations, C, work required by Regulation 6, which is change of use, insertion of materials into a cavity wall is E, and F, work involving underpinning of a building. So for yourselves, for this institution, members, structural engineers like yourselves, the key ones that will be relevant to yourselves are the erection of a building, material alteration depending on what any structural aspects that's involved, likewise with the change of use, and same thing with underpinning of a building. Those are the key structural parts of that regulation that will be most affected for yourselves. Okay, I thought I'd briefly discuss the building control process and how it works. Some of you may have come across it. Some of you may haven't. Please do bear in mind, I'm here representing local authority building control. So I can only speak on the application process for local authorities. As you're aware, there is also a separate process of putting applications in through the private sector. So the different types of applications that you can put applications through are your full plans, building notices, regularisations and partnerships. So your full plans, I'll very briefly just talk about the full plans applications. When you submit them to us, or to building control, to building control, I should say, we will check the application, comment on the application to a point where we would issue a decision notice, and that could either be an approval or rejection. Okay. In the full plans application process, there's a statutory time frame in order for us to make the decision, and that's 8 weeks. It's extended to 8 weeks. If you get a rejection, it's not the end of the world. Okay, I'll say that for now, but it's not the end of the world. You tend to find that when people get rejections, they kind of panic a little bit and think that, oh gosh, they've got to put another application in. We tend to get, the building control process does tend to get confused with the planning process quite a lot of times. So that does happen. We've got building notices. That was largely brought about for your smaller bits of work, toilet under the stairs, things like that. We don't check those applications. There's no statutory requirement for us to check it. However, one of the things in Hillingdon that we do, if we receive a building notice, we check, and there's any structural aspects to it, we check the calculations on that. Regularisations are for applications, for works that have started, and an application has not been submitted. Partnerships, a lot of local authority building control now are partnering up with local architects, local engineers, builders, things like that, and forming partnerships. So we're getting quite a lot of partnership applications coming in. On 3, inspection regime. Well, we have a number of inspections that we carry out. They've removed the statutory bar, so there isn't any more statutory inspections involved now. It's all about risk assessment now. But as you know, we carry out a number of inspections, including structural ones as well, beams, things like that. And at the end, once everything's all good and all happy and we're happy, the completion certificate gets issued. So that's basically a fly-through on the process of the building control and the application process. I'm going to now hand you over to Peter, who will take over and talk about the other bits. Thank you.
Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Tony's obviously talked about the processes of building control. What I'd just like to go on to is the structural aspects now. Under the building regulations, regarding structure, there are 3 requirements that need to be achieved. As many of you know, requirement A1 is that the building can safely carry imposed dead and wind loads and transfer them satisfactorily to the ground. And that is without it affecting the stability of other buildings. That is requirement A1. Requirement A2 is that the building can safely carry any loads imposed on it from the ground. And requirement A3 is a very important requirement, and that is that the building shall be constructed so that in the event of an accident, the building doesn't suffer collapse to an extent disproportionate to the cause. So it's always important to remember as structural engineers that's what we're trying to achieve. That's what underpins all of the structural calculations that we produce. The building regulations and requirements A1, A2, A3 only apply if the structure is a building. So we often get a lot of confusion as to does this particular structure require an application under the building regulations? There seems to be a lot of misunderstanding. It has to be a building structure. Okay, so we've always got to remember that. And there are quite a number of examples of structures, as structural engineers, that we deal with that are not building structures. The likes of bridges, retaining walls that aren't attached to the building, garden walls and the like, and also what we call in building control exempt buildings. So even structural work to an exempt building does not require a building regulations application. Okay? So whenever we're doing our structural calculations, we need to remember what we're trying to achieve. Right. go to the next slide. Approved Document A. What is Approved Document A? Well, Approved Document A is a document which was approved by the Secretary of State, which provides practical guidance on how to achieve the requirements A1, A2 and A3 of Schedule 1 of the Building Regulations for common situations encountered by structural engineers. At the back of Approved Document A is a list of all the documents, structural design codes that are approved for use on structural design by the Secretary of State. You'll find quite a number of documents referred to in the back of that of Approved Document A. It's always important to remember as structural engineers and other construction professionals that the approved documents are not a prescriptive document. A number of years ago, to try and prevent stifling of design and to allow freedom of design, it was made very clear in not just Approved Document A, but many of the other documents that we shouldn't be prescriptive. If you look at some of the older documents, they do tend to be very prescriptive. This is to allow freedom of designers. And we always make the point to engineers and architects that there may be alternative ways of achieving compliance with the requirements, and a designer is under no obligation to adopt a particular solution contained in a approved document, in our case, Approved Document A. If you prefer to meet the relevant requirement in another way, you're welcome to do so. If a designer does adopt a solution or method contained in Approved Document A, the building will be deemed to comply with the requirements A1, A2 and A3. However, if a designer believes that a relevant requirement has been met by his calculations and submission, but the local authority or building control checking authority rejects that application, then there is a method of what we call a determination, where an engineer can simply make an application to the Secretary of State to make a decision. We don't get so many structural ones, but there are structural determinations. But quite often when we're dealing with Approved Document B and the requirements under fire safety, there are lots of ways of interpreting the approved document. That only applies to full plans application. So if your client puts in a building notice, a determination is not open to him. Okay, right. We'll look at the next slide, which is what guidance exists on Part A submissions. Well, I've gathered together 3 very useful reports, and I would encourage you to gain access to them. There was a great report written about 10 years ago by Cross, and that's available online, July 2007. And that report identifies the very poor quality often of Part A submissions and makes some recommendations. Another very useful document is the ICE reports 2015. Again, it's available online. And that basically develops the Cross report and also has quite some good input from an organisation that I'm a member of. I think the chairman's here today, called ASELB, the Association of Structural Engineers of London Boroughs. Essentially, it's structural engineers that are involved in local authorities who input comments into Part A submissions. So, and the final very useful document, our good old Istructe provided a professional guidance note, and that was issued in 2015, and it's, as all structural Istructe articles and publications are, very concise and makes recommendations on submissions. It's available to members through the Structural Engineering magazine and also through the Technical Guidance Notes publication, which I believe can be purchased through the Istructe. The common problems that we find as checking engineers are a lack of a design statement identifying codes, load paths, A3 class and the like, important information. We often get problems where there's no overall engineer that's made himself responsible for the overall design, especially for overall stability, such as the splintered nature of contracts. Often we get submissions for computer calculation submissions, where there's no manual verification check carried out on the submission, and often we don't have the engineers considering the ground adequately, the likes of trees, drains, services, existing foundations and the like. So those are 3 documents I'd point you in the direction of. I'd like to just briefly talk to you. Oh, cut. Have I just turned it off? My apologies. Help. Just bear with me. Excellent, thank you. My apologies. Thank you. It was you that turned it off, wasn't it? Okay, fine. Right, let's talk about, very briefly, British standards. The British standards for structural design were withdrawn in 2010, the likes of the old 5950, 5628, 5268, and one that escapes my memory. But essentially, they've been withdrawn and no longer maintained by BSI. In fact, the last amendments were about 10 years ago. British standards for structural design are no longer referenced in Approved Document A. But there is a clause in Approved Document A which allows checking authorities to potentially continue to accept designs to British standards in certain circumstances. Let me read, without pointing at it with the clicker, the text on the left-hand side. This is in Approved Document A. There may be alternative ways of achieving compliance with the requirements, and there may be cases where it can be demonstrated that the use of withdrawn British standards, no longer maintained by British Standards Institute, continues to meet Part A requirements. So you need to check with your local authority as to whether they will accept designs to the British standards. There is one thing I'd like to mention, however, and I believe these 2 documents are 2 documents that you, again, can download on the internet. The Public Contracts Regulations 2015 and the Procurement Policy Note. And these documents are regarding public sector contracts. So any public sector contracts with a value of over 5.225 million euros, if you're working on those sort of projects, you need to make sure that the design is to the Eurocodes. And the reason is the EU issued a set of procurement directives where member states, of which we are still a member state at the moment, or we're sort of a member state. Let's move on to this. They issued a set of procurement directives, currently including the UK, to promote fair and open competition for public contracts and to obviously improve the European economy. And these are set out in EU Directive 2014-24/EU. So basically what that document says is if you're working on such contracts, you need to, and they're over 5.225 million euros, you need to design them to the Eurocodes. Right, just very briefly, because I'm running out of time, just like to identify some of the common problems that checking engineers come across. Some of them I've mentioned already, some of them perhaps not. Insufficient or inadequate drawings exposed and proposed at each floor level. You'd be surprised at some of the submissions that we do receive. Need for a design philosophy statement. So important, isn't it, to set out and explain to whoever's checking our calculations what we're doing. Confirmation of standards and codes used. Confirmation of the designer responsible for overall stability, especially on D&B contracts. There can be several subcontractors, and in today's society, people don't like to take responsibility, and it's always very unclear who is the responsible person. Inadequate consideration of existing ground conditions. Something I know that Tony, we all struggle with as engineers and local authorities, where it seems that we're left to sort out the issues on site, in the ground, and once the contractor's on site. Inadequate stability, particularly with load-bearing masonry. We find this a lot where people remove major buttressing walls and they consider the vertical loads but don't consider lateral loads. Inadequate consideration of robustness. Some of the issues we sometimes get, we do like to see innovative designs, but sometimes we get products and materials which do not comply with Regulation 7, they're not CE marked, and they don't have independent certification schemes, or maybe they do, but they're being misused and they're not following the certificate that's been given to them. And obviously submission of reams and reams of computer calculations which simply just give an answer at the end, and there's no real way of checking. So we like to see manual verification and a clear explanation of what's going on. Some photographs, just to finish off, to take the dryness out of my presentation, things that we found on site. You see on the left-hand side a steel column, which was obviously not the right length, so there's some steel packing on top of it with no bolts, trying to act as a portal frame but without any bolts. You see there's the central photograph. It's fairly obvious that a steel column's needed, some very poor quality welding, some notch joist there with an axe.
The interesting thing is you're all laughing, but these are actually real life stuff that we've actually picked up on site.
Earlier this week, I think, or was it last week, I came across a photograph which I'd like to have included with the presentation, but we get these on a regular basis, which does reinforce the fact it's important to have regulatory control. Yeah. And then you can see there's a setting out problem with that steel beam there. So there's a web splice there missing, a web splice plate, and then I don't really know how to describe the cranked beam arrangement, but it's probably quite difficult to see. That's the end of my presentation. Thank you.